Hey, alrighty, welcome back to our continued discussion of turn of the century literature and the different themes that our anthology puts forth to look at this time period in literature and history. So, next up is women's lives and the woman question and women's artistic quest. All right, what are those things? During these turn of the century times, women still could not vote. Yeah, it's hard to imagine, right? Women couldn't vote in a federal election until 1920. Yeah, yeah. So, turn of the century literature and history is before that time period. It's hard to imagine, right, that it took to the 20th century for something like that to happen, but it did. Laws were being passed to protect more rights of women, but that one still hadn't been passed, federally at least. Um, for instance, by the end of the 1800s in England, all women could hold and inherit property, as they had already been able to in the United States. So, yeah, people, could you believe that? Some women could not even hold and inherit property in England until the end of the 1800s. But things progressed a little bit faster here in the United States because we were, I think, former colonies and didn't have traditions that were set for so long. So we had a little bit more freedom there. Women had legal recourse to divorce their husbands all by the end of the 1800s, although men could still divorce their wives much more readily than women could divorce their husbands. In most cases, adultery alone was reason enough for men to be able to divorce their wives, yet not so for women to divorce their husbands. Yeah. So the nasty double standard was alive and thriving at this point. Yeah, men could divorce their women for adultery, but women could not divorce their husbands for it. Women had to make cases for abuse in addition to adultery. So that was a way women could divorce their husbands at this time. They could say, hey, I'm being abused in addition to having an adulterous husband. Finally, women were allowed to be considered as custodians of their own children in cases of divorce during this time period and were allowed sole or joint custody of their children in widowhood. But prior to that, men were awarded sole custody of the children. So, we came a long way, but still had a long way to go. Or women. I say we, okay, I'm a woman. I guess I'm lumping myself into that group. I don't want to alienate people out there who aren't women or don't put themselves in that group. All right. Anyway, the fight for women's suffrage greatly intensified during this time period. Women escalated the battle to include more aggressive attention getting, like heckling, illegal speaking, seeking arrest and enduring imprisonment, brick and stone throwing, hunger strikes, etc. And they were imprisoned. Eventually, these battles culminated in women being awarded the right to vote in federal elections in 1920 in the United States, and it was actually a literal amendment to the Constitution. That's what it took to establish that federal vote for women, and in 1928 in England. Along with suffragism, so suffragism is just a fancy word for, having the right to vote, came struggles for other important women's issues: birth control, better working conditions, better pay, more widespread access to education and healthcare, and mechanization of the more subjugating domestic and so more female-associated professions of cooking, cleaning, and sewing. The passage of the Elementary Education Act of 1870 guaranteed an elementary education to every child in England, and you had similar things happening in the United States where elementary education was being expanded through many states so that whites or blacks, girls or boys could at least gain that elementary education. So that would be, typically your whatever first through fifth grade or so. So that was greatly expanding as a concept because I think people were finally realizing how much of a difference it made to have an educated populace, especially when jobs were going more away from like the hands-on manual labor of farm work to, being able to operate machinery and things like that would require more education. You might have to read a manual, you might have to be able to do math and things like that. And so it was to both countries' benefits, both England or the United Kingdom and the United States, to educate its populace. Of course, where does the money come from? So that's always the big issue. Well, this mass education drastically increased literacy in the United States and England both, with more and more people reading and writing. The vast disparity between male and female and white and black educational levels began to level out. Thus, now armed with the necessary skills on a much broader scale, more and more women and black people became readers and writers. Many upper socioeconomic middle-class women, still retaining their leisure status of the 19th century, had time on their hands to write to this growing audience of female readers. Thus, women entered the literary marketplace in droves. That means there are a lot more women writers during this time period. Kind of exploded with the increase in literacy and the increase in leisure that mechanization provided women. They didn't have to spend as much time doing daily chores at home, and so they had a little more leisure time. And remember that woman of room of one's own that Virginia Woolf always talked about. You need that leisure time that having financial support provides, and that having a room of one's own provides. You have that time to yourself to spend and devote on writing, to be able to write. All right. Well, with this increase in female readers and female writers, the necessity for pseudonyms lessened, although still persisted for women who wanted to protect their privacy or enhance their literary ethos. So we still have women using either ambiguous pseudonyms or male pseudonyms to either get more readers if people thought they were, a male writer and so had more ethos because they were male. And ethos means more reputation, more credibility, things like that. Or they wanted to protect their privacy because there was still a stigma, in many circles against women writers. Interestingly, the number of women workers in America increased from 4 million in 1890 to 7.5 million in 1910. So almost doubled during that time period, which was only 30 years, right? Women still largely worked in the domestic sphere, and when I say domestic sphere, I mean kind of like those professions that women had been associated with for a long time, right? And that Louisa May Alcott kind of popularized in the work of hers that we read, How I Went Out to Service. So, things like, governesses and female companions and, seamstresses and things like that. So women still largely worked in those areas, but more and more started working as teachers, factory workers, accountants, typists, cashiers, and even civil service clerks. So you can see how the necessity for education was growing, and also the fact that women were being educated more and more led to their ability to take those kinds of jobs. And the explosion of inventions that came with industrialization opened up more and more jobs. Like I said, they were trying to attract even immigrants from other countries to come and fill our incredible expansion of jobs. So you can see how people would naturally turn to women too when we're like, dang, we don't have enough people to fill all these jobs, right? Oh, maybe a woman could do it. Anyway, here are some definitions of turn of the century associated literary movements. And I am just quoting these straight up from Spark Charts at Spark News. All right. So I'm just going to first quote it. So aestheticism, that is a literary term. It's a late 19th century movement that believed in art as an end in itself. Aesthetes such as Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater rejected the view that art had to possess a higher moral or political value and believed instead in art for art's sake. So that would be the aesthete or the aesthetic view. Now, this is just me talking now. I just ended the quote. The aesthete or the aesthetic viewpoint would just admire art for how it looked. It didn't necessarily have to have some higher level moral message or commentary, right? You could just be like, that's beautiful, and therefore I appreciate art just for the very aesthetics, the beauty, the outward beauty that it has alone. So that is the aesthetic movement that started in the late 1800s. All right, on to the next term, symbolists or symbolism. So symbolists are, quote, a group of French poets who reacted against realism with a poetry of suggestion based on private symbols and experimented with new poetic forms such as free verse and the prose poem. The prose poem means unquote, this is my commentary now. Prose poem means like you're not necessarily rhyming words and necessarily having, a particular rhythm and all that. It's more like everyday speech, the way we talk, being put into poetic form. Anyway, now we'll go back to the quote. The symbolists, Stéphane Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine, unquote, those are all French poets. That's why they sound a little different when I pronounce their names. Okay, now that was me talking. Go back to the quote again. Quote, are the most well-known. They were influenced by Charles Baudelaire. In turn, they had a seminal influence on the modernist poetry of the early 20th century, unquote. So now I'm talking. That was the end of that quote, defining what symbolists or symbolism is. So they used a lot of symbols. Sometimes these symbols were obscure. They didn't make sense to everybody, but they were known among the group, that maybe studied various things that they drew the symbols from. You can talk about maybe symbolism of like, say, T.S. Eliot's poetry. A lot of times he has, like in The Wasteland, some symbols that aren't maybe well understood to the general populace. You might have to study like Hindu culture, or like James Frazier's The Golden Bough, and the fertility myth, and things like that from different cultures to be able to understand and catch all of his symbols. So symbolism is like using terms that mean one thing in one sphere and borrowing them and using them in your poetry or your writing to convey a different meaning at the same time. So it's like you've got two levels of meaning going on, one on the literal level and one on the symbolic level, right? Or the metaphorical level. So that's what symbolism is. All right, next term, realism. Quote, realism is, quote, loose term that can refer to any work that aims at honest portrayal over sensationalism, exaggeration, or melodrama. Technically, realism refers to a late 19th century literary movement, primarily French, English, and American, that aimed at accurate, detailed portrayal of ordinary contemporary life. Many of the 19th century's greatest novelists, such as Honoré de Balzac, Charles Dickens, George Eliot's, unquote, this is me talking now, George Eliot's a female author, Marianne Evans, she used a male pseudonym, George Eliot, for her writing. Back to the quote. Gustave Flaubert and Leo Tolstoy are classified as realists, and we ourselves will be seeing realism in this time. Oh, that was unquote, sorry, unquote, at the end of classified as realists. Now me talking. So yeah, we'll be reading the literature of this time period. Will have those elements of realism that you'll see in them. Okay, next term, naturalism. Quote, a literary movement that used detailed realism to suggest that social conditions, heredity, and environment had inescapable force in shaping human character. Leading writers in the movement include Émile Zola, Theodore Dreiser, and Stephen Crane. Unquote. So now this is me talking. So a lot of times you'll see the forces of nature driving characters to do certain things, so you have the symbolism of nature, but also it affecting the characters and seeming as if the characters can't escape how nature kind of pushes them to certain things. You see that in Kate Chopin. Well, you see it more in her short stories. Like if you ever read The Storm, like this terrible storm happens and it drives her character to do certain things. So those are some elements of naturalism. All right, another literary term, modernism. Quote, a literary and artistic movement that provided radical breaks with traditional modes of Western art, thought, religion, social conventions, and morality. Major themes of this period include the attack on notions of hierarchy, experimentation in new forms of narrative, such as stream of consciousness, doubt about the existence of knowable objective reality, attention to alternative viewpoints and modes of thinking, and self-referentiality as a means of drawing attention to the relationships between artist and audience and form and content, unquote.